into the shadowy world of pirates. Not the Hollywood kind, but the real, rough, wind-beaten world that once ruled the edges of the map. At the heart of it all stands one of the most feared and fascinating figures to ever haunt the seas, Blackbeard. His real name was Edward Teach, and he wasn't just a legend. He was very real and far more calculated, eerie, and powerful than the stories often suggest. As always, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from, and what time is it for you? Whether you're drifting off to sleep or just looking to disappear into the past for a while, I hope this story brings you a little peace and a little wonder. This is a story shaped by cannon fire, salt air, and silence between the waves. A story hundreds of years old, and tonight, it's all yours. It is difficult to say with any real precision when the first pirate crept out from behind a headland, squinted into the morning sun, and decided that stealing things from people on boats was a better use of his time than growing vegetables or paying taxes. But if one had to take an educated guess, one might point to the Bronze Age, around the 12th century BCE, when human beings were just beginning to discover the joy of long-distance trade, and shortly thereafter, the misfortune of encountering other human beings who had also discovered the joy of long-distance theft. This was a time when the Mediterranean world was a patchwork of fledgling empires and independent coastal cities. Egypt was still ruled by pharaohs with elongated skulls and an almost pathological fondness for monumental architecture. The Hittites held sway over parts of Anatolia and Syria, while the Mycenaean Greeks were building fortified palaces and wondering vaguely where their economy had gone. Into this precarious balance came a group of people so mysterious that historians still do not agree on who they were, where they came from, or what precisely they were angry about. They are referred to in Egyptian records with a sort of frustrated reverence as the Sea Peoples. In hieroglyphs carved meticulously into temple walls, the Egyptians described these seaborne raiders as coming from the north and arriving in terrifying flotillas. Entire coastal regions fell before them. Cities burned, trade collapsed. Pharaoh Ramesses III, who had the good sense to document his misfortunes in some detail, claimed that the Sea Peoples swept through Anatolia and the Levant like locusts, destroying everything in their path before attempting to invade Egypt itself. Ramesses managed to repel them in a battle that reads more like a biblical plague than a naval engagement. According to temple inscriptions at Medinet Habu, the Egyptians constructed a trap using their fleet and caught the Sea Peoples in a narrow inlet, where they were summarily dispatched with arrows, javelins, and no small amount of shouting. But the damage had been done. The Eastern Mediterranean would take centuries to recover from the sudden disintegration of its trade routes and cities. The Sea Peoples may have been pirates, or they may have been refugees, or mercenaries gone rogue. The truth is, we do not know. What we do know is that the fear they inspired was enduring. Their arrival coincides with the so-called Late Bronze Age collapse, a period when complex societies across the region seem to fall apart all at once, as if knocked over by a great and invisible hand. While scholars continue to debate whether earthquakes, drought, or economic fragility played the largest role, the Sea Peoples appear in the narrative like bandits arriving at the scene of a slow-motion car crash and deciding to help themselves to the valuables while everything burns. As trade resumed centuries later, piracy returned with it, as reliably as gulls following a fishing boat. The Mediterranean Sea, for all its historical and aesthetic charm, has always been particularly suited to piracy. It is warm, rich in ports, surrounded by densely populated coasts and absolutely crammed with small islands, behind which a ship might wait with suspicious patience. Once sailors began moving goods between places like Egypt, Phoenicia, and Crete, it was only a matter of time before other sailors decided to take those goods without paying for them. And so, long before there were galleons or pieces of 8 or skull and crossbones flags fluttering dramatically in the wind, there were pirates, grimy, sunburned men in stitched linen kilts, rowing longboats and arguing over amphorae full of olive oil. What is perhaps most notable about these early pirates is how persistently they reappear in the written complaints of nearly every ancient civilization that attempted to conduct business by sea. The Greeks hated them, the Phoenicians despised them, the Romans, who would eventually create one of the most formidable navies the world had seen, began their seafaring experience by being utterly terrorized by them. From the very start, piracy was more than a nuisance. It was a destabilizing force capable of wrecking entire economies and altering the course of wars. And unlike bandits on land, who might be chased into the hills and forgotten, pirates had the sea. They had wind and water and 1,000 places to hide, and that made them terrifying in a way no highwayman ever was. There is a certain grim poetry to this beginning. The sea, which from a distance seems vast and tranquil and indifferent, turns out to be the perfect stage for human mischief. And piracy, far from being an aberration or an accident of history, seems baked into the very fabric of seafaring life. In the end, the birth of piracy did not come with a dramatic proclamation or a black flag raised high on the mast. It came in the form of small, desperate acts, of men who looked at the shimmering promise of merchant sails on the horizon and thought to themselves, rather sensibly, that it might be easier to take than to trade. By the time the classical world came into full bloom, piracy had already entrenched itself not just as a recurring nuisance, but as a fully accepted reality of maritime life. In ancient Greece, the line between a sailor and a pirate was less a line and more of a smudged suggestion. The word pirate itself finds its root in the Greek pirates, a term that originally meant something close to one who attacks or makes an attempt, which tells you almost everything you need to know about how the Greeks viewed the sea, as a place where boldness, not decency, tended to get results. Homer, in his epics, never quite separates the notion of a heroic seafarer from that of a raider. In the Odyssey, when strangers meet, it is entirely normal for one to ask the other whether he is a merchant or a pirate, and the question is delivered without moral judgment. It is less like asking whether one is a thief, and more like asking whether one prefers sheep or goats. Piracy was not necessarily criminal. In many cases, it was simply vocational. The Greek islands, dotting the Aegean Sea like scattered breadcrumbs, created perfect conditions for this kind of ambiguous profession. Small, difficult to govern, and often poor in resources, these islands bred independence and opportunism in equal measure. Many communities relied on fishing, trade, or raiding, often all three. If trade was good, goods were exchanged. If it was bad, then someone was boarded and relieved of their valuables. Entire regions, particularly in the southern Aegean and along the coasts of Asia Minor, became known for harboring pirates. The practice was so widespread that it became a form of diplomacy in itself. City-states would sometimes form temporary alliances with seaborne raiders to disrupt their enemies' trade routes. A few particularly audacious city-states even provided their pirates with safe harbors in return for a share of the spoils, a practice that would later become a favorite pastime of Caribbean governors in powdered wigs. By the 4th century BCE, as the Hellenistic world expanded in the wake of Alexander the Great's conquests, piracy flourished in the commercial chaos he left behind. The Mediterranean became a more interconnected economic system, and with that came greater opportunity for disruption. As trade boomed between ports in Greece, Egypt, Syria, and beyond, so too did the number of opportunists willing to interrupt those transactions with swords and grappling hooks. By the 2nd century BCE, piracy was no longer an occasional problem for merchant captains, but a systemic threat to Mediterranean commerce. Nowhere was this more pronounced than in the rise of the Cilician pirates, who made their base along the rugged southern coast of Anatolia, a stretch of shoreline that was remote, mountainous, and difficult for any centralized authority to properly monitor. It was ideal terrain for men who preferred the sea and had no interest in rules. The Cilician pirates were not the sort of pirates who occasionally boarded a grain barge and called it a day. They were organized, aggressive, and surprisingly sophisticated. At their peak, they commanded fleets of hundreds of ships, most of them sleek and fast, capable of outpacing the heavier merchant vessels of the day. They were known to launch coordinated raids across wide areas of coastline, looting not just ships at sea, but towns and villages along the shore. Their activities grew so bold that they once kidnapped the entire crew of a Roman grain fleet and held it for ransom, causing a significant food crisis in the city of Rome. Worse still, the pirates began to target Roman citizens and nobles, including the occasional high-ranking senator traveling by sea. Kidnapping became a business model. Ransoms could be set high, and payments were usually delivered with remarkable speed, particularly when a captured official's family feared the possibility of an heir arriving by courier. The most famous of these kidnappings involved a young Julius Caesar who was captured by Cilician pirates in the year 75 BCE while en route to Rhodes to study oratory. The pirates, not recognizing their captive's ambition, demanded 20 talents of silver for his release. Caesar, never one to miss an opportunity to display his particular brand of imperial arrogance, laughed at the sum and insisted they raise it to 50. He informed his captors that, once released, he would see them all crucified. The pirates, bemused by the young man's confidence, treated him with something close to affection. He joined in their games, recited poetry, and even shushed them when he wanted to nap. True to his word, after his release and ransom, Caesar raised a small fleet, tracked down the pirates, captured them, and had them crucified, though in a gesture of mercy, he reportedly ordered their throats cut first. It was the kind of thing that ancient Romans considered a gentleman's compromise. Caesar's little episode was a warning shot. Rome, a republic expanding steadily eastward, could not ignore piracy much longer. By the mid-1st century BCE, the disruption caused by seaborne raiders had reached crisis levels. Roman trade was being strangled, and the price of imported grain had soared. In 67 BCE, the Roman Senate finally acted with something approaching panic and granted sweeping emergency powers to one of their most capable generals, Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, better known to posterity as Pompey the Great. What followed was one of the most decisive and effective anti-piracy campaigns in history. Pompey, a man who rarely thought small, divided the Mediterranean into 13 zones and assigned a fleet and commander to each. Within just 3 months, his forces had cleared the western Mediterranean of pirates. Those who surrendered were often resettled inland, far from any shipbuilding opportunities. Those who resisted were killed without ceremony. The eastern Mediterranean took a bit longer, but not by much. By the end of the year, the major pirate strongholds of Cilicia had been taken. the fleets burned or captured, and order more or less restored to the sea lanes. For a time, piracy ceased to be a dominant threat. Rome's merchant class rejoiced. Senators congratulated themselves. And Pompey added another line to a resume that would later lead him into a rather ill-fated rivalry with Caesar. But the sea, much like history, does not stay calm for long. While Rome's might was sufficient to suppress large-scale piracy for a generation or two, it never truly went away. It simply went quiet, waiting for new trade routes, new conflicts, and new opportunities. The Romans, despite their military genius, never found a way to eliminate piracy permanently. They suppressed it, punished it, occasionally co-opted it, and eventually succumbed to the same decentralization and corruption that had allowed it to flourish in the first place. What this long and rather grim chapter of Mediterranean history tells us is that piracy, far from being an aberration or a deviation from the norm, has always been a kind of equilibrium condition. It rises in the gaps left by empire. It flourishes wherever trade outpaces security. It slips through the cracks in the walls of power. The ancient world never solved piracy. It simply learned to live with it, a little like rats in the granary or mold on the bread. And just as the Greeks and Romans thought they had cleared the sea of bandits, new generations would rise elsewhere, far across the Atlantic, where the edges of empire were even wilder, and the sea was, once again, full of shadows. When the Roman Empire finally collapsed, or rather sagged slowly into a long and unspectacular death, it left behind a world that had become accustomed to structure. For nearly 5 centuries, Roman power had extended across the Mediterranean basin and deep into Europe, bringing with it roads, aqueducts, civic architecture, and something loosely resembling law. When that scaffolding crumbled, what remained was a continent of isolated settlements, shrinking populations, and lords who ruled by might more than mandate. Trade routes deteriorated, towns decayed, and coastal watchtowers that once relayed signals from one outpost to another fell silent. This silence, heavy and unfamiliar, spread like fog across the continent, and with it came an opportunity, a vacuum on the sea that would soon be filled by men who did not ask permission. In the north, the threat came with the chill of salt wind and the long silhouettes of ships that moved like shadows over the water. The first recorded Viking raid struck the monastery of Lindisfarne in 793 AD, and it did so with such brutal finality that chroniclers described it not simply as an attack, but as the opening of a nightmare. The monks at Lindisfarne, who were not particularly used to defending themselves and spent most of their time copying biblical texts and feeding chickens, were entirely unprepared for the arrival of armed Norsemen with axes and a preference for plunder. The monastery was sacked, its treasures stolen, its holy men murdered or taken as slaves. In later accounts, the writers struggled to explain the violence, often attributing it to divine punishment for unspecified sins, because it was easier to imagine the wrath of heaven than the return of organized sea raiding on such a scale. The Vikings, of course, were not pirates in the romantic or even criminal sense. They were a people, not a profession. But what they practiced in the British Isles and along the coasts of northern France, Ireland, and the Iberian Peninsula was undeniably piracy, albeit on a cultural scale. Viking raids continued for centuries, increasing in sophistication and ambition, eventually culminating in outright settlements and kingdoms. What began as short bursts of violence evolved into sustained campaigns of pillage and occupation. Monasteries, towns, and trade posts became routine targets. And while it is tempting to imagine these raids as isolated lightning strikes, they were often planned, repeated, and profitable. Exactly the sort of conditions in which piracy thrives. For generations, the sight of a dragon-prowed longship sliding silently into a fjord or river delta was enough to cause entire communities to flee inland, abandoning livestock and goods in the hope of avoiding fire and slavery. What made Viking piracy especially effective was their mastery of the sea. Their ships, built for speed and shallow draft, could sail up rivers as easily as they crossed open water. This gave them the ability to strike far beyond coastal areas, launching attacks deep into continental Europe. Paris, for instance, was besieged more than once by Norsemen, who had simply rowed up the Seine with an alarming sense of entitlement. The scale of Viking raiding was such that Charlemagne himself, a man not given to displays of emotion, was reportedly moved to tears upon hearing that his coastal subjects were fleeing inland in panic. Even the Holy Roman Emperor could not build fortresses fast enough to match the speed of the ships. Meanwhile, in the south, a different kind of maritime threat emerged. As Islamic empires expanded across North Africa and into the Iberian Peninsula, the sea lanes of the Western Mediterranean became a contested space, not just of military conflict, but of economic predation. From bases in what are now Morocco, Tunisia, and Algeria, Muslim seafarers began to launch attacks on Christian coastal communities. These were not ad hoc or disorganized affairs. Moorish freebooters, particularly during the 9th and 10th centuries, conducted deliberate raids across southern Europe, targeting Sicily, Sardinia, Corsica, and even the mainland coasts of Italy and France. Cities like Genoa, Pisa, and Marseille fortified their harbors and built up defensive navies, not out of imperial ambition, but because it became increasingly clear that their very survival depended on their ability to repel maritime aggression. One of the most dramatic and unsettling episodes occurred in the year 846, when Muslim raiders from North Africa sailed up the Tiber River and launched a direct assault on Rome itself. The city, though a shadow of its former imperial self, still held enormous symbolic weight in Christendom. The attackers did not reach the heart of the city, but they did sack several major churches outside the old Aurelian walls, including St. Peter's Basilica. They looted treasure, desecrated sacred spaces, and sent an unmistakable message that no place was beyond their reach. In response, Pope Leo IV built a massive fortified wall around the Vatican Hill, a structure that still exists in parts today. The message, received by both the attackers and those watching from afar, was clear. The sea, once again, had become dangerous. For centuries, Christian and Muslim powers would take turns accusing one another of piracy, though in practice, both sides used raiding as a tactic of war and enrichment. Religious justification was applied after the fact. It is important to understand that piracy in this period was not necessarily distinct from warfare. In an age where navies were small, centralized power was limited, and communication was slow, acts of piracy were often unofficial extensions of state policy. A group of Moorish corsairs plundering a Christian village might be praised as warriors of the faith by their rulers, and condemned as pirates by their victims. Likewise, Christian raiders who struck at Muslim ports were often described as crusaders or heroes, though their methods were indistinguishable from those of their enemies. The labels changed depending on who held the quill. Throughout the early Middle Ages, piracy continued to flourish in precisely those regions where governments were weakest. The Western Mediterranean, with its patchwork of small kingdoms and rival city-states, became a hunting ground for opportunists. coastal settlements lived in a state of anxious vigilance. A watchtower on a rocky promontory was not a quaint architectural flourish, it was a necessity. In many cases, cities retreated from the water's edge, building further inland and erecting walls to discourage attackers. Fishing, once a daily rhythm of life, became a cautious venture. Merchants traveled in convoys. Pilgrimages were delayed or rerouted. The sea, once a symbol of connection and abundance, had become a frontier marked by danger and uncertainty. What unites the stories of the Viking and Moorish raiders is their opportunism. Both exploited the same fundamental conditions: weak defenses, valuable cargo, and slow communication between rulers and their far-flung subjects. In doing so, they kept alive an ancient truth, that the sea does not belong to the lawful, but to the bold. Their legacies were not romantic, nor were they sanitized by time. They left behind burned villages, disrupted economies, and entire generations who learned to look at the horizon not with hope, but with fear. As Europe stumbled toward its high medieval period, the raiding would continue, but it would also evolve. Future pirates would learn to dress their actions in legality, carrying papers from kings and queens. They would sail not only for plunder, but for private profit. But the pattern, the rhythm of it all, the waiting in coves, the sudden violence, the disappearance into the blue, would remain unchanged. The names would shift, the ships would grow larger, but the ocean, vast and permissive, would always find room for a man with a fast boat and no qualms. As the medieval world edged slowly towards something resembling modernity, the balance of maritime power shifted yet again, and with it came a new era of piracy, more organized, more political, and in some ways more terrifying. By the 15th and 16th centuries, the Mediterranean had become not a shared sea, but a contested borderland, a long and narrow corridor of blue between Christian Europe and the expanding Islamic empires of the Middle East and North Africa. It was a place where religion, commerce, and warfare blended into something uniquely volatile. Nowhere was this more evident than in the rise of the Barbary corsairs, a group of seafarers who operated out of the North African coastline and came to dominate the central Mediterranean with an efficiency that rivaled anything Rome had ever managed. The Barbary coast, as it came to be known in European texts, stretched roughly from modern-day Morocco to western Libya. Its major ports, Tunis, Tripoli, and Algiers, were technically under the control of the Ottoman Empire, but in practice they operated with a kind of semi-autonomous swagger. Local rulers, or beys, maintained their own fleets and formed uneasy alliances with Ottoman admirals and Istanbul's bureaucrats, depending on the tides of politics. It was in these harbours, beneath minarets and desert winds, that piracy matured into a powerful system, one that blurred the lines between mercenary, merchant, and state actor. Unlike the Viking raids, or the isolated acts of medieval piracy, the Barbary corsairs turned seaborne plunder into something close to an industry. They did not simply attack ships on a whim. They patrolled, they intercepted, they negotiated ransoms with professional decorum. Their captains were often multilingual, literate, and well-versed in the art of diplomacy. And their targets were not only enemy warships or merchant vessels flying Christian flags, but coastal villages and remote settlements where captives could be taken for labor or ransom. For many Europeans living within reach of the sea, the threat of being taken by Barbary pirates was constant. It was not dramatic or cinematic. It was a slow-burning dread, the kind of fear that led people to lock doors before dusk and teach children to hide in caves at the sound of oars. Between the 16th and early 19th centuries, it is estimated that over 1 million Europeans were captured and sold into slavery by Barbary pirates. The numbers are staggering, though often overlooked in popular memory. These captives came from Italy, France, Spain, the British Isles, and even as far north as Iceland. Some were sailors taken during naval battles, others were fishermen dragged from their boats, and many were entire communities kidnapped during coastal raids. Their fate depended on their skills and the wallets of their relatives. Wealthy families might buy back their kin through intermediaries, often monks or diplomats acting on behalf of Christian nations. Others were not so fortunate and spent years, even decades, laboring in quarries, serving as oarsmen, or working in private households under the searing North African sun. Some converted to Islam in the hope of leniency. A few rose through the ranks of local society, but most were simply absorbed into the machinery of servitude and vanished from the record. At the heart of this system stood men like Hayreddin Barbarossa, one of the most famous corsairs of the 16th century. Born on the island of Lesbos to a Muslim father and a Christian mother, Hayreddin, whose name meant goodness of the faith, began his career as a privateer alongside his older brother Arouj. The brothers initially targeted Christian shipping on behalf of the Ottoman Empire and local rulers, but their ambitions soon outgrew their commissions. Arouj gained fame for rescuing Muslim refugees from Spain during the Inquisition, ferrying them across the sea and occasionally exacting a little vengeance on Spanish ports along the way. When Arouj was killed in battle, Hayreddin inherited not only his brother's ships, but his reputation. He went on to command vast fleets, conquer coastal cities, and eventually became the admiral of the Ottoman navy. His beard, famously red, gave rise to the European nickname Barbarossa, a name that would later echo faintly in the legend of another bearded terror who would haunt the Atlantic. Hayreddin Barbarossa was not simply a pirate. He was a statesman, a strategist, and a builder of empires. But he also never abandoned the corsair roots that had brought him to prominence. Under his leadership and the continued support of the Ottoman Empire, Algiers became a center of power, feared and respected across the Mediterranean. The corsair fleet based there grew large enough to challenge European navies, and for a time, no merchant ship was truly safe between Gibraltar and Crete. The ports of the Barbary coast buzzed with activity. Slave auctions, the fitting out of new vessels, the loading of captured goods, and the quiet but steady negotiation of ransom deals. Corsair captains returned from raids with exotic loot, coinage from 5 continents, and prisoners who spoke unfamiliar dialects. The cities grew rich, their mosques expanded, and their palaces became more ornate. It was piracy, but it was also economics, diplomacy, and statecraft woven together in an intricate tapestry. The Christian powers, for their part, reacted in familiar fashion. They condemned the corsairs as heretics and barbarians, issued official proclamations, sent diplomats, and occasionally launched punitive expeditions that accomplished very little. Spain, Portugal, France, and later Britain all waged sporadic wars against the Barbary states, bombarding ports, burning ships, and demanding the return of captives. Yet these efforts rarely resulted in lasting peace. Corsair activity would cease for a time, only to resume once the navies sailed home. In some cases, Christian rulers simply paid off the pirates, offering annual tributes to ensure the safety of their ships. It was in effect protection money, and though it galled the diplomats who signed the treaties, it was often the most practical solution available. What made the Barbary corsairs particularly frustrating to their enemies was the legitimacy they cloaked themselves in. Unlike bandits or criminals operating in the shadows, the corsairs functioned within the framework of Islamic law and Ottoman politics. They were not outlaws but agents of power, recognized and sanctioned by sultans and beys. Their activities, far from being condemned, were seen as part of a holy struggle against infidel empires. This religious justification, combined with the economic incentives of piracy, made the system durable. It was not a rogue movement, it was a policy. By the 17th century, European powers had begun to adapt. Some launched more effective naval campaigns, capturing corsair ships and building their own fast galleys to match them. Others hired pirates of their own, commissioning Christian corsairs to attack Muslim shipping and disrupt the slave trade in reverse. The line between piracy and warfare grew thinner still. Captains changed sides, cities betrayed alliances, and the Mediterranean became a sea where the flag on the mast might change overnight. A corsair in Tunis might retire one year and sail under a French letter of marque the next. Loyalty was not a matter of principle, it was a matter of profit. The Barbary corsair era would persist for centuries, longer than most empires, and far longer than most of their victims could have imagined. It would not end until the age of gunpowder empires gave way to industrial navies, and until European powers grew confident enough to crush the coastal strongholds with overwhelming firepower. But in its heyday, the corsair system was an empire in itself, floating on ships, flying flags of shifting allegiance, and capturing not just goods, but the imagination of the world. It is here, in this world of holy war and sea raids, that piracy achieved something truly remarkable. It became not merely tolerated or practiced in the margins. It became state policy, wrapped in banners and religious verse, executed with precision, and occasionally celebrated with parades. It was theft, yes, but it was dignified theft, woven into the fabric of politics and faith. And as later generations of pirates would discover, legitimacy was often a matter of timing and paperwork. The Barbary corsairs may not have seen themselves as ancestors to the outlaws of the Atlantic, but the legacy they left behind, a legacy of ruthless pragmatism, clever negotiation, and unrelenting ambition, would echo far beyond the shores of the Mediterranean. When European ships began to nose their way westward across the Atlantic in the late 15th century, it was not out of a love for the unknown. There was no poetry in their sails. There was, however, an immense hunger for gold. The so-called Age of Exploration was, from the start, an exercise in imperial ambition with just enough religion and cartography mixed in to keep it respectable. Spain led the charge. It was Spain that sponsored Columbus and his famously incorrect estimate of the Earth's circumference. And it was Spain that, by a combination of steel, smallpox, and sheer audacity, laid claim to enormous tracts of the New World. The empires they toppled, Aztec, Inca, Maya, had been accumulating wealth for centuries. Much of it was melted down, stamped into coins, and loaded onto ships bound for Seville and Cadiz, escorted by prayers, cannons, and increasingly by dread. The scale of Spanish extraction was staggering. From the early 1500s onward, fleets of galleons sailed regularly from the Americas, carrying gold and silver mined by indigenous laborers and African slaves. The mines of Potosi, in what is now Bolivia, became legendary for their productivity and for the number of human lives consumed in the pursuit of precious metals. The silver was hauled across the Andes on llama caravans, floated down rivers, carried across isthmuses, and finally packed into ships for the long and perilous journey home. These treasure fleets, as they came to be known, represented not only staggering material wealth, but a clear and visible target for anyone with a fast ship, a few cannons, and a willingness to be called a criminal. It is here, along the newly carved sea lanes between the old world and the new, that piracy found a fresh and irresistible stage. The Atlantic was vast, ungoverned, and full of lonely places to hide. Islands with fresh water and no watchtowers. Reefs where a slow galleon could run aground. Bays that opened like arms and closed like traps. And while the Spanish crown did its best to guard its riches with warships and bureaucracy, the sheer volume of treasure moving across the ocean ensured that some of it would inevitably be lost. Some to storms, some to incompetence, and increasingly, some to men in smaller, faster vessels who believed that a well-timed ambush was as good as a royal charter. Other European powers, particularly England, France, and the Netherlands, watched Spain's New World profits with a mix of jealousy and indignation. Officially, they condemned piracy and demanded fair treatment of their merchants. Unofficially, they encouraged the practice as long as the victims were Spanish and the spoils found their way into the right hands. To make this arrangement more palatable, they invented the legal fiction of the letter of marque, a document that transformed a pirate into a privateer, a rogue into a patriot. It was a form of legalized piracy, carefully worded to give monarchs plausible deniability and to give raiders a sense of legitimacy. A privateer was, by definition, a pirate with paperwork. The most successful of these men, and among the earliest to make a career of raiding the Spanish Main, was Sir Francis Drake. His reputation has undergone revisions over the centuries, but in his own time, he was seen as both hero and menace, depending on which side of the cannonball one stood. In the 1570s and 1580s, Drake crisscrossed the Caribbean and the Pacific in search of Spanish treasure ships, sometimes with the blessing of Queen Elizabeth thus, sometimes with little more than a nod and a prayer. He became the first Englishman to circumnavigate the globe, a feat he accomplished while looting half a dozen ports and capturing a number of ships, including the famously rich galleon Nuestra Señora de la Concepción, which the English, in a flourish of irreverence, nicknamed the Cacafuego. That particular haul included silver, gold, pearls, silk, and enough ballast to impress even the most cynical courtier. Drake was not alone. The era produced a long and occasionally confusing list of sea captains who blurred the lines between patriotism and plunder. The Sea Dogs, as they came to be known, were a loose fraternity of English privateers who treated the Spanish Empire as both a geopolitical enemy and an open-air bank. Some were veterans of land wars. Others were merchants turned raiders. All of them understood that a well-executed attack on a treasure ship could make a man wealthy for life, that it might also cost him that life was a risk they accepted with varying degrees of enthusiasm. For the Spanish, the privateer menace was relentless. Convoys were organized with greater discipline. Ships were built with thicker hulls and more cannons. Watchtowers were constructed in key ports from Veracruz to Cartagena. But the ocean remained too large, the pirates too numerous, and the temptation of easy wealth too strong. In many ways, the real vulnerability of the Spanish system was its dependence on predictable routes. The treasure fleets followed the same currents, used the same stopover islands, and loaded in the same ports year after year. It was a masterpiece of logistical planning, but it was also a gift to anyone with a map and a disregard for international law. Even when captured, the pirates and privateers of this age were not always treated as criminals. Courts in London and Paris often found creative ways to excuse their behaviour. A raid might be justified as a preemptive strike. A stolen cargo might be reclassified as a strategic acquisition. It was, after all, easier to forgive piracy when the proceeds funded fortifications, naval construction, or the royal wardrobe. What was treason one year might be knighted the next. Drake himself was given a title by Queen Elizabeth after returning with his spoils, and he was widely admired not just for his courage, but for his astonishing financial return on investment. Privateering, for all its dangers, could be profitable enough to shift the course of diplomacy. By the early 17th century, piracy in the Atlantic had become a recognized feature of maritime life. It was no longer confined to the margins. It was integrated, institutionalized, and in many cases, encouraged. The Atlantic world was growing, its trade routes expanding, and its edges bristling with activity. Along the coasts of Africa, in the Caribbean islands, and in the harbours of the American colonies, new generations of seafarers were learning the craft of navigation, the weight of powder, and the value of a quick decision. Some were merchants, some were soldiers, and some were men who had once sailed under a nation's flag, but found, after peace had been declared, that no one was hiring. The sea, ever impartial, welcomed them all. By the middle of the 17th century, the western edge of the Atlantic had transformed into a churning mosaic of imperial ambition, commercial speculation, and lawlessness, framed by an ever-shifting shoreline of alliances and rivalries. Nowhere was this more visible than in the Caribbean, a region that had become, through a combination of neglect, greed, and geography, the most lucrative and chaotic frontier of its age. It was here, among the scattered islands and shallow harbours, that a new breed of pirate emerged, less tethered to nation or monarch, and far less interested in maintaining appearances. They called themselves buccaneers, and their story sits at the very heart of what would later be remembered and misremembered as the golden age of piracy. The word buccaneer is itself a curiosity, born from a misunderstanding of meat. The French term boucanier originally referred to the practice of curing wild game, particularly pork, on a wooden frame over a slow-burning fire. This method, brought to the islands by French hunters and refugees, gave the region its name for these men, who often survived by hunting cattle on the neglected island of Hispaniola and trading the meat to passing ships. These early settlers lived at the edge of society, outside the reach of government, church, or charter. Some were former indentured servants, others were deserters, outlaws, or men who had found European civilization less forgiving than the tropical sun. In time, they discovered that attacking Spanish ships could be even more profitable than trading salted meat, and thus a new profession began to take shape, not with proclamations or flags, but with the slow erosion of alternatives. The Spanish, for their part, had built a vast colonial empire across the Americas and treated the Caribbean as their private reservoir. They claimed exclusive rights to the region's ports and trade routes and were quick to brand any interlopers as trespassers, heretics, or worse. This created a peculiar kind of hostility in the region, one that was both ideological and economic. Protestant powers like England and the Dutch Republic, locked in intermittent wars with Spain, found it convenient to ignore or even support the activities of the buccaneers, so long as the raids were aimed at Spanish targets. These men were not formally privateers, but neither were they entirely condemned. They operated in the grey zone of empire, tolerated when useful and discarded when no longer convenient. By the 1650s and 1660s, buccaneering had developed into a rough trade with its own customs, vocabulary, and code of behavior. Crews were typically organized around democratic principles, with captains elected by vote and booty divided according to prearranged shares. Articles of agreement were drawn up before each voyage, listing not only how plunder would be distributed, but also rules for conduct on board, punishments for theft among crew, and compensation for injuries. It was not a system of law in the conventional sense, but it was orderly enough to function. Discipline was maintained not through rank but through consent, and the success of a voyage often depended on the cohesion of its crew rather than the authority of its captain. This arrangement, deeply unorthodox by the standards of naval tradition, offered a kind of freedom that attracted men from every corner of the Atlantic world. Their base of operations was Port Royal, Jamaica, a town that had once been a sleepy Spanish harbour, but had transformed into one of the most notoriously debauched cities in the New World. Following the English seizure of Jamaica in 1655, Port Royal became a haven for privateers, smugglers, and merchants who were happy to exchange goods without troubling themselves about where those goods had come from. The port bustled with activity, its docks choked with ships and its taverns thick with smoke and noise. It was a place of excess and opportunity, where fortunes could be made and lost in the space of a single evening. By the standards of the age, Port Royal was both a marvel and a warning, a city that thrived on vice and volatility. Among the most infamous of the buccaneers to rise from this era was Henry Morgan, a Welshman whose career reads like a case study in ambition, violence, and historical ambiguity. Morgan began his life in the Caribbean as an indentured servant, but quickly found his way into the world of privateering, where his skills as a leader and strategist became apparent. He commanded several successful raids against Spanish possessions, including the sacking of Puerto Príncipe, Portobello, and most famously, Panama City. That last expedition, conducted in 1671, was a logistical feat and a diplomatic disaster. Morgan's force marched for days through jungle and swamp, fought a pitched battle outside the city, and then proceeded to loot, burn, and scatter its inhabitants. The fact that England and Spain were technically at peace at the time only complicated matters. Morgan was arrested, brought back to London, and then, after a short delay, knighted and sent back to Jamaica as Lieutenant Governor. This peculiar outcome, in which a pirate was punished with a promotion, reveals much about the attitude of European powers toward maritime raiding. So long as it hurt Spain and helped commerce, piracy could be redefined as patriotism. Morgan was not an isolated case. Many buccaneers found themselves in the employ of colonial governors, or at least under their protection. Raids were planned with the quiet approval of officials, who often received a share of the profits in exchange for silence. Ships were outfitted in public view, and letters of marque were issued with a flexibility that bordered on farce. The result was a region where piracy became institutional, if not entirely official. The Caribbean was no longer a wilderness of ungoverned space. It had become a network of semi-sanctioned plunder, a place where the boundaries of law were redrawn by each tide. But such arrangements were fragile. As the 18th century approached, the larger imperial powers began to view the buccaneers as liabilities rather than assets. The growth of commerce, the rise of sugar plantations, and the increasing importance of stable colonial administration all demanded a more orderly sea. Port Royal itself suffered a symbolic collapse in 1692, when a massive earthquake struck the town and sent much of it sliding into the sea. Buildings crumbled, streets disappeared beneath the waves, and hundreds were killed. Survivors interpreted the disaster in biblical terms, a divine reckoning for a city that had hosted every known sin. Whether it was judgment or geology, the effect was the same. Port Royal never fully recovered. The buccaneers, once welcomed as defenders of English interests, were gradually outlawed and driven from the harbours that had sustained them. Those who survived, or arrived too late to benefit from the golden years, turned their eyes east and south. A new route opened across the Atlantic and around the Cape of Good Hope to the Indian Ocean, where merchant ships of the Mughal Empire and the East India Companies sailed heavy with goods and light with guards. Some pirates joined this route, hoping to replicate their Caribbean successes. Others remained in the Americas, lurking along lesser-known channels, operating from isolated coves, or biding their time in places like the Bahamas, where the presence of law was more suggestion than force. It was into this world, a world of fading buccaneers, shifting alliances, and restless seamen, that a new generation of pirates would rise. Many of them were men who had once fought for their country under flags of war, only to find themselves adrift in peace. They had learned to navigate, to fight, and to survive in the confusion of empire, and when they turned to piracy, it was not out of romance, but out of habit. They had inherited the tools of war and the skills of navigation, but no place to belong. And in this, perhaps, lies the true legacy of the buccaneers, not in their raids or their plunder, but in the kind of men they produced. Men who did not fear the sea, men who had no homeland, men who knew that loyalty was a negotiable thing, and that the difference between a hero and a villain often depended on which flag flew overhead. The early years of the 18th century were marked by a war that most people outside of a university seminar would struggle to explain in any detail, though its effects rippled across continents and reshaped the balance of maritime power for decades to come. It was called the War of the Spanish Succession, and it was, depending on one's perspective, either a justifiable effort to prevent the union of two great crowns under one monarch, or an extended and rather theatrical squabble over inheritance and dynastic pride. The details were intricate, as dynastic politics often are, but the basic facts were these. When Charles II of Spain died without an heir in 1700, various European powers descended upon the question of who ought to control his vast empire. France supported one candidate, Austria another, and soon the rest of Europe was either dragged in by treaty or tempted in by opportunity. What followed was over a decade of warfare in which armies marched and countermarched across Europe, while naval fleets clashed from the Mediterranean to the Caribbean. The English called it Queen Anne's War, naming it, as they often did, after the reigning monarch rather than the conflict's origins. In North America, it became a colonial war of raids and counter-raids. Along the Atlantic, it became a theatre of naval combat, and in the Caribbean, it became something else entirely, a proving ground for the men who would later haunt it with darker intentions. The war offered a generation of sailors, gunners, and petty officers an education in seamanship, tactics, and cruelty. Among them was a man whose name would eventually surpass that of kings and admirals in both fear and fascination. His name was Edward Teach, though even that is not entirely certain. Some records say Thatch, others give slight variations, and like much else about him, the truth is cloudy. Very little is known about Teach's early life. It is generally believed that he was born in England, possibly in or near the port city of Bristol, sometime around 1680. Bristol was a city deeply entangled in Atlantic trade, including the slave trade, and would have been filled with the smells of tar, rum, and hemp, and the sounds of dock workers, press gangs, and the creaking of ropes in salt wind. If Teach grew up there, he would have been surrounded by ships and sailors from an early age. He may have learned to read and write, as some later reports suggest he was literate and fond of books. He may have gone to sea as a young man aboard a merchant vessel or as a privateer's apprentice. The evidence is thin, but the general consensus is that by the time Queen Anne's War broke out, Edward Teach had already spent years learning the language of the sea. It is during this war that he emerges from the historical mist, first as a member of an English privateering crew, sailing against Spanish and French ships in the Caribbean and along the American coastline. Privateering, though technically legal and often celebrated in polite society, was for many men simply a more organized form of piracy, clothed in the language of patriotism and carried out under the seal of a monarch. Letters of marque were issued to ship captains, authorizing them to attack and capture enemy vessels. The profits from these captures, known as prizes, were divided among the crew, the ship's investors, and the issuing government. In practice, this arrangement produced ships full of hardened men, eager for combat and driven by a precise and violent calculus. The greater the prize, the greater the reward. A man like Teach would have learned quickly that success at sea was as much about intimidation as it was about firepower, and that the difference between wealth and starvation often hinged on the ability to seize another man's ship without sinking it in the process. Privateering during Queen Anne's War was not glamorous. Conditions aboard these ships were brutal. Food spoiled quickly, water went foul, and disease spread with unnerving speed. Scurvy, dysentery, and fever took a heavier toll than cannonballs. Crewmen lived in close quarters, slept in hammocks or on bare wood, and spent their days sweating through long shifts in a humid and dangerous world. Discipline was harsh. Desertion was punishable by death. And yet for many young men, including Teach, privateering offered a path that no other trade could match. It promised not only profit, but freedom from the grinding poverty of dockside life. It gave them a chance to escape the rigid social structures of Europe and to live by their own wits, their own blades, and their own sense of order. The war itself was a drawn-out and complicated affair, full of temporary alliances, inconclusive battles, and distant treaties. In the Caribbean, it meant the disruption of trade and the constant threat of attack. Spanish ports were blockaded or sacked. French colonies were raided. English privateers operated with near impunity, often returning to Jamaica or the Bahamas to refit and spend their earnings in a burst of fleeting luxury. For a time, Port Royal remained a hub of these operations, though its influence was waning after the earthquake of 1692. New Providence Island in the Bahamas began to attract more attention, and the region as a whole became a magnet for enterprising men with few scruples. It was in this turbulent environment that Teach honed the skills he would later use to such chilling effect. He learned how to read the wind and currents, how to crew a vessel with a minimal complement of men, how to bluff an enemy into surrender, and perhaps most importantly, how to spot hesitation. He would have encountered death in its various forms, quick and noisy, slow and septic, accidental and deliberate. He would have come to understand that the sea could not be reasoned with, that ships could vanish in the night, and that justice was often nothing more than the opinion of the man holding the musket. By the end of the war in 1713, thousands of privateers found themselves suddenly unemployed. The treaties were signed, the letters of marque were revoked, and the ships were decommissioned or sold. Men who had spent the better part of a decade fighting under national flags were cast aside with little compensation and even less direction. Some returned to England or the colonies to seek work, only to find that their skills did not translate well to peacetime labor. Others drifted from port to port, picking up what work they could as sailors or dockhands. And a few, unwilling to give up the only life they had ever known, turned to piracy, not as a betrayal of their former allegiance, but as a continuation of the same work, now freed from the constraints of legal oversight. Edward Teach was among this last group. He did not retire. He did not fade away. He remained in the Caribbean, waiting. The war had taught him what ships carried what cargo, what captains could be frightened, what islands offered shelter, and what conditions produced surrender. He had learned the contours of cruelty and the value of spectacle. All he needed was the right moment, the right ship, and the right name. These would come soon enough. And when they did, the man who had learned his trade under Queen Anne would rise again, not as a servant of the crown, but as something altogether more dangerous. The signing of the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713 brought an official end to the War of the Spanish Succession, but it did not bring peace in any satisfying or immediate sense to the people who had fought it. For kings and ministers, the treaty was a diplomatic milestone, neatly resolving the tangled dynastic claims that had triggered the war in the first place. Borders were redrawn, colonies exchanged, and great powers congratulated themselves on a balance preserved. But for the thousands of sailors, soldiers, and privateers who had spent the last decade hauling cannon, storming decks, and sleeping in wet hammocks, it was not so much a resolution as it was a dismissal. The war was over, they were told, and now it was time to go home. The trouble was that for many of them, home had ceased to exist in any meaningful way. Their livelihoods, such as they were, had been shaped entirely by conflict, with no more prizes to claim, no enemies to pursue, and no legal framework to justify their raiding. They were cast off like tools no longer needed. Across the Atlantic world, ports that had once thrived on war contracts and privateering began to sink into a kind of economic gloom. Shipyards slowed, taverns emptied. Men who had once earned a share of captured treasure now competed for work as ordinary sailors or laborers. For many, the transition to peace proved impossible. They had spent too many years under canvas, too many nights in danger, and had grown too accustomed to the strange freedom that life at sea offered. They had no property to return to, no trade to fall back on, and little desire to accept the wages and restrictions of legal maritime employment. The end of war had not brought them safety or security. It had brought them redundancy. In the Caribbean, the situation was even more pronounced. The region, having been a major theatre of naval engagement, had drawn in a disproportionate number of privateers during the war. Jamaica, the Leeward Islands, and the Bahamas had teemed with ships and sailors operating under letters of marque, all of them legally sanctioned to harass and loot enemy commerce. Now those letters were revoked, and the colonial governments that had once benefited from the influx of plunder were no longer willing or able to support the men who had delivered it. Colonial governors, many of whom had turned a blind eye to raiding during wartime, began to speak of order and restraint. Naval officers, formerly comrades in arms, now patrolled the waters in search of their former allies, reclassified overnight as criminals. The shift was abrupt, bureaucratic, and deeply disillusioning. It was in this atmosphere of betrayal and dislocation that piracy was reborn. Not piracy as it had existed in the past, isolated, opportunistic, and fringe, but piracy as a full-scale alternative economy, fueled by desperation and sustained by skill. The men who turned to it in the years after the war were not castaways or landless vagabonds. Many were experienced sailors, well-versed in gunnery, navigation, and the logistics of naval operations. They had served on ships of the line. They had fought in coordinated fleet actions. They knew the value of discipline, the limits of wind and current, and the vulnerable points in the imperial trade network. And now, with no one left to pay them, they began to apply that knowledge in service of their own survival. The most important moment in this transformation came not from politics, but from weather. In 1715, a Spanish treasure fleet sailing from Havana to Spain was struck by a hurricane and wrecked along the coast of Florida. The ships, 11 in total, carried vast quantities of silver and gold from the New World mines, and their destruction scattered this wealth across reefs, shoals, and beaches. Salvage operations were immediately launched by the Spanish, who dispatched divers and teams of laborers to recover what they could. But word of the disaster traveled quickly, and soon the coast was teeming with English privateers, out-of-work sailors, and opportunists hoping to claim a portion of the treasure for themselves. What followed was a chaotic series of confrontations, in which men who had once operated within the bounds of wartime legality openly attacked salvage vessels and looted the remains of the fleet. These were not pirates in name, not yet, but their actions made it clear that the line between legitimacy and outlawry had all but dissolved. One of the men who participated in these raids was Henry Jennings, a former privateer who led a successful attack on Spanish salvage camps and returned to Jamaica with enough bullion to draw the attention of colonial authorities. Jennings was declared a pirate, fled to the Bahamas, and eventually became a leading figure in what would soon be called the Pirate Republic of Nassau. He was not alone. Dozens of former captains and crewmen followed a similar path, driven not by ideology or vengeance, but by the blunt arithmetic of survival. The Bahamas, and especially New Providence Island, emerged as the ideal refuge. The harbour was deep and defensible. The colonial administration was weak. The surrounding waters were full of targets. And most importantly, there was no one with the strength or will to stop them. By 1716, New Providence had become a gathering place for this new breed of pirate. It was not yet an organized society, but it had the elements of one: ships moored in the harbor, crews dividing loot on the beach, and a growing sense of solidarity among men who had once served different flags. There were Englishmen, Frenchmen, Scots, Dutch, and Africans, all drawn together by a shared contempt for the structures that had abandoned them. They began to speak of rights, of voting, of codes of conduct. They elected their captains and removed them if they failed. They distributed shares of plunder with a rigour that would have astonished any Royal Navy quartermaster. They called each other brothers and acted, not always nobly, but with a strange consistency of purpose. It was, in its own unruly way, a kind of republic, lawless, unstable, and always on the brink of collapse, but real enough to attract attention. Somewhere within this emerging world, Edward Teach was watching. He was not yet Blackbeard. He had not yet braided slow-burning fuses into his beard or captured ships with the force of a legend. But he was present, quietly assembling the knowledge, the crew, and the reputation that would soon make him one of the most feared men on the sea. He had learned from the war that strength alone did not inspire terror. What mattered was appearance, confidence, and the ability to make others believe that resistance was futile. He understood that in the vacuum left by peace, those who moved quickly and acted decisively could reshape the world around them. The war had given him the tools. Now peace had given him the motive. What followed would not be a return to old piracy, but the beginning of something new, an era of violence, spectacle, and cunning, in which a man's name could strike fear across oceans and his shadow could outlast the ships he sank. The Golden Age was coming, not as a renaissance, but as a storm. And Edward Teach, who had once fought for Queen and Crown, would soon raise a darker flag of his own. It was sometime in the late months of 1717 that Edward Teach, still largely unknown beyond a few Caribbean ports, captured a ship that would turn him into something more than just another pirate. Until then, he had been a competent and rising figure among the loose network of outlaw crews gathering in the Bahamas and beyond. But he had not yet done anything to separate himself from the ranks of other men who had drifted from war into piracy. He had likely participated in raids, probably taken a share of the salvage along the Florida coast, and was by all accounts a man of considerable presence and self-control. But what happened off the coast of Martinique in the closing weeks of that year altered the course of his life and began the construction of the myth that would soon follow him into every harbour on both sides of the Atlantic. The ship in question was a large French slave vessel named La Concorde, one of the merchant workhorses of the transatlantic triangle that linked Europe, West Africa, and the Caribbean in a loop of suffering, labour, and profit. La Concorde had left Nantes in July of that year, sailing to the coast of Benin to collect enslaved Africans for delivery to the sugar plantations of the French Caribbean. The vessel had completed this grim transaction and was on its return leg to France when it was intercepted by Teach and his small flotilla. Accounts vary on exactly how the engagement unfolded, but there is broad agreement that the French crew, already diminished by disease and weakened by the hardships of the voyage, surrendered with little resistance. Some reports suggest that Teach fired a few warning shots. Others claim that the very sight of his approach was enough to convince the French captain that a fight would be futile. What mattered was not the ease of the capture, but the value of the prize. La Concorde was a substantial ship with high decks, ample storage, and the ability to carry heavy armaments. Teach saw immediately what it could become. He took it as his flagship, renamed it Queen Anne's Revenge, and outfitted it with 40 guns, a formidable arsenal for a vessel of its size. In doing so, he gave himself not only a mobile fortress, but a symbol. The name was not chosen at random. Queen Anne, the monarch under whom he had once served as a privateer, was now dead, and the throne had passed to the German-born George I. To christen his ship Queen Anne's Revenge was to make a statement, one that carried both nostalgia and defiance. It was a reminder of old allegiances and a declaration of new ones, phrased not in politics, but in iron and powder. It was also at this point that Edward Teach, who had kept his name quiet in the ports and ship manifests that still bore the faint scent of legal scrutiny, began to be referred to by another name, Blackbeard. The nickname may have arisen earlier, but it appears with frequency in the reports and rumours that followed his capture of the French ship. It described him with literal clarity. He wore a long, thick beard that he allowed to grow untrimmed, braiding it with black ribbons and letting it hang in coils across his chest. He was a large man, broad-shouldered and tall, and though there is no surviving portrait of him drawn from life, eyewitness descriptions give the impression of someone who understood the value of theatricality. He did not drink to excess. He did not rant or babble or surround himself with madmen. He was, by most accounts, calm, calculating, and highly intelligent. But he also knew that fear was a weapon, and he began to shape himself into something that could be carried ahead of his sails like a shadow. The transformation was not instantaneous. Teach did not suddenly become a legend, but the capture of La Concorde gave him the tools and the platform. With the Queen Anne's Revenge at the center of his small fleet, he began to expand his operations. He recruited more men, took on supplies, and made alliances with other pirates in the region, including the notorious Charles Vane and the more colorful Calico Jack Rackham. He likely continued to work closely with Benjamin Hornigold, the older pirate who had mentored him during his early years in Nassau. Hornigold, who would eventually accept a royal pardon and retire from piracy, had a habit of sparing English ships, preferring to attack only the Spanish and French. Teach showed no such scruples. Once he had his own command, he struck at whatever target presented itself, provided it was rich and vulnerable. The crew of La Concorde, meanwhile, was treated with what might charitably be called professional interest. The French officers were set ashore, some with small boats and provisions, while others were eventually released on nearby islands. A few of the enslaved Africans, who had survived the voyage, were brought aboard Queen Anne's Revenge and offered places in the crew. Whether they accepted willingly or under threat is difficult to say, but it is clear that some of them remained with Teach in the months that followed. Pirate ships of this era were often more racially integrated than their national navies, not out of any particular ideology, but because loyalty and competence were valued over heritage. A man who could fight and sail was a man worth keeping. With the Queen Anne's Revenge under his control, Teach began to develop the practices and style that would later define his reputation. He did not rely on overwhelming force alone. He cultivated fear deliberately, employing flags, symbols, and behavior designed to terrify before a shot was ever fired. He raised a black banner with a skeletal figure holding an hourglass and a spear, standing beside a bleeding heart. A crude image by modern standards, but unmistakable in its message. He learned that a well-crafted appearance of ruthlessness could achieve what violence could not. If a merchant captain believed he was facing a monster, he was more likely to surrender than fight, which preserved the cargo and spared the need for repairs. Teach was not needlessly cruel. He was, in fact, remarkably restrained in an era when bloodshed was often the default. But he understood that terror was a currency, and he spent it with care. It is here, in the final months of 1717 and the early weeks of 1718, that Edward Teach ceased to be a man moving among others and began to be something else entirely. His name began to appear in colonial records. Merchants whispered of him. Governors asked questions. Letters describing his sightings were sent from Jamaica to Charleston to London, and always with a tone of unease. He was not yet the most successful pirate of his generation, nor the wealthiest, nor even the most prolific in terms of ships taken. But he was, increasingly, the most feared. And that distinction, more than gold, more than glory, was the one that would follow him to the end. There is a moment in many stories when a man steps across the line from fact into myth, not because he seeks it out, but because the circumstances begin to arrange themselves in his favor. For Edward Teach, now firmly known to most as Blackbeard, that moment came not with a single act of brutality or a great naval engagement, but through the slow and deliberate cultivation of fear. He understood, perhaps more than any of his contemporaries, that power on the sea was as much about perception as it was about firepower. Ships could be outgunned, cargoes could be lost, but a reputation, once firmly rooted in the minds of merchants and governors, could do more to win a battle than the best-placed cannonball. And so Blackbeard, in the early months of 1718, began to craft the image that would outlive him by centuries. He was, by all surviving accounts, a man of theatrical instincts. Before closing in on a target, he would prepare himself with unsettling precision. He would dress in dark clothes, strap multiple pistols across his chest, sling a cutlass at his hip, and tuck fuses, slow-burning pieces of hemp cord, beneath his hat, which he would then light. The cords would smolder and smoke, wreathing his face in thin tendrils of fire and sulfur, turning him into something unearthly as he strode the deck of his ship. Witnesses described him as monstrous, with wild eyes and a beard that hung in thick braids to his chest. In the cramped and nerve-racked world of early 18th century maritime life, where superstition thrived and nerves were easily rattled, the appearance of such a figure could provoke panic long before a shot was fired. But Blackbeard's genius lay in knowing when to stop. For all the horror his image inspired, he rarely killed needlessly. In fact, he seemed to prefer bloodless victories. The ideal capture, in his view, was one in which the enemy surrendered at the mere sight of him. There was no plunder in a burned hull, and no profit in corpses. His fearsome appearance was a tool, one that allowed him to intimidate without having to fight. He used his reputation as a weapon, carefully sharpened with every encounter, every rumor, and every exaggerated report that circulated from ship to port and across oceans. His ship, Queen Anne's Revenge, became a floating symbol of dread. With its high stern, broad decks and 40 guns, it was one of the most heavily armed vessels in the West Indies. It travelled not alone, but at the head of a small fleet of sloops and captured ships, each carrying its own crew of eager and well-practiced outlaws. Together, they formed a mobile force capable of blockades, assaults, and evasions. Blackbeard positioned himself at the center of this formation, not merely its commander, but its figurehead. And as his fame spread, so too did the stories. He was said to have dozens of wives, to consort with demons, to drink rum laced with gunpowder. He was credited with rituals, with curses, with unexplained powers. Much of it was false, of course, but Blackbeard did little to correct the record. The myth served him well. In the spring of 1718, he made his most audacious move yet. With his fleet in formation, he sailed to the port of Charleston, South Carolina, and anchored at the entrance to the harbor. For nearly a week, he imposed a blockade on the city, capturing every ship that attempted to enter or leave. His demands were not for gold or weapons, but for medicine. Specific supplies including mercury, often used to treat syphilis and other ailments that plagued sailors. Whether the request was strategic or desperate is unclear, but the gesture was unsettling. Here was a pirate, with a fleet under his command, disrupting the commerce of a major colonial city and holding its people hostage not for treasure, but for salves and tinctures. The message was unnerving in its ambiguity. He could have destroyed the town, but he did not. He could have demanded riches, but he did not. Instead, he asked for what seemed like a shopping list from a sick room. And then he left. The blockade of Charleston marked the height of Blackbeard's notoriety. Colonial officials were humiliated. London took notice. Rewards were offered, letters exchanged, and plans set in motion to bring this menace under control. But Teach himself, always watchful, had already begun to adjust. Shortly after the blockade, he deliberately ran Queen Anne's Revenge aground on a sandbar near Beaufort Inlet in North Carolina. Whether it was an accident or a calculated move remains debated, but the outcome was clear. The ship was lost, and with it went much of the fleet. Blackbeard abandoned it, along with a significant portion of his crew. Some were left stranded on the coast. Others were dispersed. He took only a few trusted men and made off in a smaller, swifter vessel. This act, cold and sudden, revealed another layer of Teach's character. He was not merely a performer or a brute. He was, when necessary, a strategist of remarkable cynicism. By shedding his large ship and his swelling crew, he returned to a position of greater mobility and secrecy. He could move through the inlets and rivers of the Carolina coast without notice. He could strike without warning and disappear just as quickly. The marooned men, many of whom had followed him loyally, were furious, but they were powerless. The age of brotherhood was ending. The age of self-preservation had begun. Blackbeard soon accepted a royal pardon from the governor of North Carolina, Charles Eden, a man whose understanding of the law was flexible when properly encouraged. Teach settled briefly in the town of Bath, where he appeared to take on the guise of a retired gentleman. He hosted dinners, courted the daughter of a local planter, and made vague statements about leaving his past behind. But beneath the surface, he had not changed. He continued to slip out to sea on quiet raids, often returning with goods that were quietly sold or handed over to local officials in exchange for silence. It was a delicate game, and one that could not last indefinitely. The authorities in neighboring Virginia were growing impatient, and plans were already being drawn up for a more decisive end to his career. For now, though, he remained at large, a man who had built a legend with smoke and fear, who had seized his moment in history not by the scale of his violence, but by the precision of his performance. He had understood, better than most, that in a world crowded with blades and sails, the man who could make himself unforgettable was the man who would survive. By the spring of 1718, Blackbeard had become more than a name. He had become a phenomenon, a shadow that passed across the water before any sail came into view. His tactics had grown bolder, his circle of allies larger, and his reputation more deeply entrenched in the fears of merchants, sailors, and colonial administrators alike. His flagship had been lost, his ranks trimmed, yet his presence seemed only to deepen, as though concentrated by the pressure of royal pursuit. He now commanded a smaller but more agile force, loyal and purposeful, and with it he undertook the most audacious operation of his life, the blockade of Charleston. Charleston, known then as Charlestown, was the most prominent city in the southern American colonies, a bustling port lined with wharves, warehouses, and wealthy merchants whose fortunes were tied directly to the unbroken movement of goods. It was a city built on commerce and anxiety. Its citizens had grown accustomed to the threat of attack from land and sea, but they had never imagined that a pirate fleet might anchor just beyond their harbour and shut them off from the world with quiet precision. Yet that is precisely what happened. In late May of 1718, Blackbeard and a small fleet of ships, possibly as many as 4, but certainly enough to control the approaches, positioned themselves at the mouth of the harbour and began capturing every vessel attempting to enter or exit. Over the course of 6 days, he took at least 9 ships, including one that carried prominent citizens of Charleston among its passengers. What made the blockade so disturbing beyond its daring was the silence of it. There was no bombardment, no attack on the city itself. No shots were fired at its defences. Blackbeard simply held the harbour closed, as if pinching off a vein. The captured passengers, including Samuel Wragg, a respected member of the colony's council, were treated well enough, though not gently. Blackbeard issued a demand not for gold or rum or weapons, but for a chest of medicine. Specifically, he requested supplies including mercury and various other drugs used to treat the diseases that commonly plagued men at sea. Some believed he had fallen ill himself. Others speculated that his crew was riddled with venereal disease, or that he simply sought to replenish his floating infirmary. Whatever the reason, the demand was non-negotiable. The citizens of Charleston were, at first, paralyzed. The militia was ill-prepared, the fort's cannons poorly positioned, and the local authorities stunned by the boldness of the act. There was no precedent for such an operation. Pirates had struck ships, even towns, but they had never held an entire city's lifeline in their hands without firing a shot. After some delay, the medicine was gathered. Messengers were sent to the pirate fleet. The negotiations were not conducted face to face. Blackbeard communicated through intermediaries, maintaining the image of remote authority. The hostages were eventually released, unharmed, though frightened and humiliated. Their accounts, when they returned, were detailed and widely circulated. The city had been helpless. The pirate had come and gone as he pleased. What followed was not a looting of Charleston, or a massacre, or even a lingering threat. Blackbeard simply departed. With the medicine in hand and the city properly rattled, he released the ships, lifted the blockade, and sailed away toward the outer banks of North Carolina. The act had not enriched him directly, at least not in gold, but it had elevated his legend to a new plateau. News of the blockade spread rapidly, and not just through rumor. It was discussed in the newspapers of Boston and London, written about by colonial governors, and referenced in official correspondence sent to the Board of Trade. Blackbeard had struck not only a city, but the nerves of empire. He had shown that a pirate, commanding a handful of ships, and without the backing of any navy or government, could bring an entire colony to a halt with nothing more than timing and nerve. There is an eerie simplicity to the event. The blockade of Charleston did not involve pitched battle or bloodshed. It was, in a sense, administrative. A controlled pause imposed on a bustling artery of commerce, followed by a demand and a retreat. Yet in its restraint, it revealed something more unsettling than chaos might have done. It showed that Blackbeard understood his enemies better than they understood him. He knew their fears, their dependencies, their unwillingness to act without permission. He used the very machinery of colonial caution against itself, delaying action through indecision and paralyzing his opponents with their own reverence for procedure. The Charleston blockade was not a raid. It was a lesson. And like all lessons that touch the foundations of power, it was not forgotten. Governors began to speak his name with urgency. Admirals took note. Rewards were increased. And in Virginia, a particularly energetic and self-righteous administrator named Alexander Spotswood began to turn his attention southward, sketching plans for an operation that would end Blackbeard's career for good. But Teach, for the moment, seemed unconcerned. He withdrew again to the tangled inlets of North Carolina, where the water ran shallow and the law ran thin. He had the medicine he needed, the loyalty of his crew, and a new round of stories sailing ahead of him. He had closed a city, secured what he sought, and vanished without penalty. It was, by any measure, a triumph. But triumphs do not linger in the Caribbean air for long. The seas were changing. The tolerance that once allowed pirates to flourish among the scattered colonies was beginning to erode. Letters of pardon were being issued, but they came with deadlines and stipulations. British warships were appearing more frequently along the coasts. Merchants were speaking with one voice. What had once been considered a rogue's trade was now viewed as a threat to empire. Blackbeard had become too famous, too effective, too symbolic to ignore. And though he could still move through the waters like a phantom, there were now eyes fixed on every tide he crossed. He had reached the peak of his power. The sea still bent around him, but in the distance, a harder wind had begun to rise. Following the audacious blockade of Charleston, Blackbeard withdrew to the quieter waters of North Carolina. He had already lost his flagship, Queen Anne's Revenge, a few months prior when it ran aground near Beaufort Inlet. Whether by accident or design remains one of the many questions that still lingers around his name. Some believe he deliberately wrecked the vessel as a way to downsize, to rid himself of crew members he no longer trusted or needed, or perhaps to obscure the trail of his growing wealth. Others argue that the grounding was simply a miscalculation on a treacherous stretch of coast. Whatever the truth, it left Blackbeard in command of a smaller vessel, the Adventure, and a more selective crew. He had become leaner, more agile, and more cautious. And now, after Charleston, he seemed to vanish. Not into hiding, but into something subtler. He retreated into civility. His destination was Bath, a small and relatively new settlement in North Carolina, perched on the edge of the Pamlico River. It was a quiet town by comparison to the riotous harbours of Jamaica or the growing plantations of the southern coast, but it had a useful feature. Its local government was weak, and its loyalties were easily persuaded. Charles Eden, the royal governor of North Carolina, had shown himself amenable to arrangements that blurred the lines between legality and profit. He had little military force at his disposal and little appetite for conflict. He was not the kind of man to chase a famous pirate into the marshes, particularly when that pirate arrived at his doorstep offering a pardon and, more importantly, a share of future earnings. Blackbeard accepted a royal pardon in June of 1718. It was a clever manoeuvre. The British government, attempting to rid the seas of pirates without committing a fleet to the task, had issued broad offers of clemency to any pirate who surrendered within a set window of time. The offer was generous, but it came with a deadline, and many pirates viewed it with suspicion. Some feared it was a trap. Others refused to give up their freedom for a piece of parchment. Blackbeard, ever pragmatic, took the pardon, but did not abandon piracy. He simply changed its flavour. He remained in Bath, appearing at times as a gentleman of leisure. He may have married a local woman. He attended dinners, entertained visitors, and spoke with the smoothness of a man who understood the value of appearing respectable. Beneath the surface, however, he had not changed. From his quiet anchorage in the inlets and rivers of the Carolina coast, Blackbeard continued to make brief but profitable excursions. He attacked small trading vessels, intercepted rum and sugar shipments, and moved his goods discreetly through the hands of friendly merchants. He worked in concert with corrupt officials, who either looked the other way or took their share. Governor Eden, though not directly implicated, benefited from the flow of commerce and did little to disturb it. Blackbeard had created a kind of miniature empire, a zone of influence that extended from the marshes to the courtrooms, protected not by cannon, but by silence. Nassau, once the pirate capital of the West Indies, had begun to change. In the past, it had welcomed men like Blackbeard with open arms and few questions. It had been a republic in all but name, run by the votes and codes of pirate crews, its docks crowded with stolen ships and its taverns alive with talk of the next raid. But by 1718, the British government had lost its patience. They sent Woodes Rogers, a former privateer with an unsentimental view of pirates, to serve as governor and clean up the port. Rogers arrived in Nassau with soldiers, ships, and a mandate. He offered pardons with one hand and readied the noose with the other. Many pirates took the offer and tried to vanish into new lives. Others were captured and hanged. Nassau became less a haven and more a memory. Blackbeard had seen this coming. His withdrawal to North Carolina, his dealings with Governor Eden, his selective and quiet operations, all of it suggested a man who understood that the golden age was ending. He had spent his early years learning the trade of war. He had risen quickly, wielded fear with expert precision, and dominated the seas for a season. Now he was retreating, not in defeat, but in calculation. He was still dangerous, still unpredictable, but he was also vulnerable. The empire that had once ignored him now had him on its list. The peace that had driven men like him to piracy was now producing the bureaucracies and naval patrols that would make piracy impossible. There was a kind of fatigue creeping into his story. Not weakness exactly, but weariness. His operations grew smaller. His circle of allies thinned. He had secured a pardon, but it had not made him safe. He had charmed officials, but they could not protect him forever. He had manipulated the fear of others for years, but now found himself at the mercy of fears he could not control, of betrayal, of surveillance, of rising attention. He remained in his hideouts along the Carolina coast, but the silence around him had changed. It was no longer freedom. It was the beginning of isolation. The final act had not yet begun, but the curtain was already starting to shift. In Virginia, Governor Alexander Spotswood, a man with a firmer grasp on authority and a deeper resentment of Blackbeard's continued existence, was beginning to make preparations. He had no jurisdiction over North Carolina, but he was not a man to be deterred by legality. He saw in Blackbeard not just a pirate, but an insult, a public failure of law that needed to be corrected. And so, quietly, he began to move pieces into place. Blackbeard, for his part, continued to live as if the danger had not changed. He sailed short distances. He drank in friendly company. He watched the rivers, the tides, and perhaps the horizon. He may have believed that his past reputation would keep him safe, or that his relationships would hold. Or perhaps he simply understood, more clearly than anyone, that a man like him was not meant to die quietly in his bed. By the autumn of 1718, the figure of Blackbeard had become something larger than the man himself, an unsettling presence that lingered on the edges of official maps and within the correspondence of increasingly nervous colonial governors. His raids had grown less frequent, but more troubling in their implications. He was no longer the storm that struck and vanished into the sea. He had become a permanent fixture rooted in the waterways of North Carolina, protected by both geography and bureaucracy. From the shallow inlets near Ocracoke Island to the quiet estuaries along the Pamlico Sound, he moved like a phantom through terrain few British warships could safely enter. His friends in the local government, or at least those with something to gain, continued to shield him in silence. To many in London, it appeared that Blackbeard had built not just a base, but a state within a state. But his enemies were gathering. Chief among them was Alexander Spotswood, the Lieutenant Governor of Virginia, a man of ambition, sharp mind, and little patience for the murkiness of frontier politics. He had been watching Blackbeard for some time, increasingly frustrated that a pirate of such infamy could exist in relative peace so close to his own waters. He considered North Carolina's governor, Charles Eden, either incompetent or complicit, and he had no intention of allowing diplomatic courtesy to stand in his way. Though Spotswood had no authority to launch military action in another colony, he decided that the situation required decisiveness over delicacy. With quiet determination, and without informing Governor Eden, he ordered an operation to remove Blackbeard permanently. The plan he devised was careful and swift. He dispatched 2 small sloops southward, each crewed by detachments of British Marines and sailors under the command of Lieutenant Robert Maynard, a young but capable officer in the Royal Navy. The ships were modest, lightly armed, and designed not for open battle, but for maneuverability in the shallow waters where Blackbeard made his home. Their mission was not to challenge him at sea in a grand engagement, but to catch him at anchor, corner him if possible, and ensure that he could not escape. It was a hunt disguised as enforcement, carried out without ceremony, in the hope that its conclusion would be decisive and final. Blackbeard, for his part, appeared to be unaware of what was coming. He had recently returned to Ocracoke Island after a brief voyage, and while he remained cautious, there is little to suggest that he expected a direct assault from a neighbouring colony's navy. His ship, Adventure, was moored near the island, and he had with him only a small crew, perhaps 20 men, far fewer than he had once commanded. He may have believed his pardon still held weight, or that his alliances in North Carolina offered some measure of protection. Or perhaps, after years of danger, he had grown weary of scanning the horizon for threats. Whatever the reason, when Maynard's sloops arrived in the early morning hours of November 22nd, 1718, Blackbeard was caught in a moment of relative stillness. The battle that followed was short, brutal, and unlike the carefully staged performances that had defined Blackbeard's career. There was no psychological warfare, no bluff, no time for calculated intimidation. As Maynard approached, Blackbeard opened fire with cannon and musket, forcing one of the British sloops to fall back with heavy casualties. But Maynard had anticipated the trap. He kept most of his men below deck, presenting the illusion that his crew had been decimated. When Blackbeard boarded the sloop to finish the job, he found himself suddenly overwhelmed as dozens of British sailors rushed up from the hold and met him in hand-to-hand combat. The fight was savage. Cutlasses flashed, pistols fired at close range, and men fell into the bloody water. Blackbeard, towering and still terrifying even without his usual theatrics, fought with a fury that would later seem almost cinematic. According to Maynard's report, the pirate sustained at least 5 gunshot wounds and more than 20 sword cuts before he finally collapsed. Even in death, he refused to fall quickly. When the smoke cleared, his body was stripped of weapons and his head severed. Maynard hung the head from the bowsprit of his ship and sailed back to Virginia as quietly as he had come. Blackbeard's death did not end piracy in the Americas, but it did mark the end of an era. His name had become a kind of shorthand for everything the Empire feared, a rogue agent of violence, charisma, and chaos who had operated not as a madman, but as a professional. He had understood how to command not just a ship, but a story, how to haunt the minds of his enemies long before they ever met him in person. He had used fear like a scalpel, cutting through resistance with suggestion rather than brute force. And when the time came to face death, he did not run. He fought as he had lived, directly, defiantly, and with an eerie kind of control. In the months that followed, Governor Spotswood issued proclamations praising Maynard's bravery and assuring the public that the threat had been vanquished. But even in triumph, there was a sense of something unresolved. Blackbeard's presence lingered, not in his physical form, which had been buried unceremoniously, but in the spaces he had once ruled. His name continued to drift through the tides of the Outer Banks, spoken in taverns and whispered by sailors who claimed, even years later, to have seen his shadow among the reeds. The British Empire had won, but the sea had not forgotten. In the days following the battle at Ocracoke, as Lieutenant Robert Maynard sailed north with Blackbeard's severed head, hanging from the bowsprit of his sloop like a grim trophy, a different kind of battle was beginning to unfold on land. It was not a battle of blades or powder, but of narrative, of who Blackbeard had been, what he had represented, and why a man of such presence had come to such a violent end. Officially, the matter was considered resolved. A notorious pirate had been eliminated, colonial order had been upheld, the waters were once again safe for merchants and ministers. But the neatness of that conclusion never quite held. The sea, after all, has a long memory, and the truth, once severed from its body, often floats back to the surface in unexpected forms. Governor Alexander Spotswood wasted no time in presenting himself as the architect of justice. He issued public statements framing the operation as both lawful and necessary, although the law itself had been stretched, if not entirely ignored. Spotswood had invaded another colony's jurisdiction without informing its governor, had commissioned an extrajudicial raid using forces not under his legal authority, and had executed a man who, on paper at least, held a royal pardon. But such details mattered little to the larger imperial narrative. The crown had grown weary of piracy, the merchants had demanded action, and Spotswood had delivered a severed head. That, for most, was enough. The head itself was displayed on a pike at the mouth of the Hampton River, a public warning to any who might still dream of following in Blackbeard's wake. There it remained for months, slowly decaying in the salt air, until it became less a deterrent and more a curiosity. People came to see it, not in fear, but in fascination. This was the head of Blackbeard, the pirate who had closed Charleston, who had sailed with flaming fuses in his beard, who had vanished and reappeared like a phantom among the inlets of the Carolinas. And now it was just a skull in the wind, slowly stripped of the man it once adorned. But even as his body disappeared, his story began to take on new and stranger shapes. Tales of Blackbeard spread along the coast and across the Atlantic. Sailors who had never seen him claimed to have fought beside him. Rumors of his treasure, never found, began to surface in every port where a tavern served warm ale. Some claimed he had buried vast hoards of gold along the banks of the Pamlico River. Others insisted that he had made a pact with the devil, and that his soul had been claimed the moment his head was severed. There were those who said he could not be killed by mortal hands, that his ghost could still be seen wandering the dunes at twilight, searching for something left behind. In death, he became larger than he had ever been in life. Part of the legend's endurance came from the vacuum left behind. Blackbeard had filled a unique space in the geography of fear and power. He had not ruled a kingdom or commanded armies. He had not made speeches or written proclamations. He had led no rebellion and founded no colony. Yet in the strange intertidal zone of empire and wilderness, law and survival, he had represented a kind of authority all his own. He had negotiated with governors and terrorized merchants, manipulated the tools of government while rejecting its control. He had become a symbol, not of chaos, but of autonomy, of a man who had mastered the rules well enough to break them with elegance. When he vanished, there was no one who could quite take his place. There were other pirates, of course. Charles Vane, who resisted the pardon and was eventually hanged. Calico Jack Rackham, more flamboyant than formidable, whose legacy would be carried not by his deeds, but by the women, Anne Bonny and Mary Red, who sailed beside him. Bartholomew Roberts, the so-called Black Bart, who would become perhaps the most successful pirate in terms of prizes taken. But none of them cast the same kind of shadow. None of them understood, as Blackbeard had, the performance of fear. None combined brutality and restraint with the same unsettling elegance. He had been, in every way, the right man for a very brief and specific moment in history. A moment when the empires were overextended, when the sea was still wild, and when a man with no country could briefly rule a coastline. In time, the golden age of piracy passed. The Royal Navy expanded its presence. Governors grew less forgiving. The laws tightened. Pardons expired. The ocean, once a loose and elastic frontier, became a managed corridor of commerce. Pirates were hunted, tried, and forgotten. The Caribbean settled into something quieter, something more domesticated. But Blackbeard remained. His likeness, or at least the idea of him, began to appear in ballads and broadsides, in the tales of children and the worries of ship captains. He was remembered not just as a villain, but as something older and more archetypal, as a force that had once reminded the world that the sea could not be owned, only visited. There is no grave to mark his passing, no monument to Edward Teach, no final resting place for the man who became Blackbeard. His bones may lie beneath the sand at Ocracoke, or perhaps farther out, where the waves erase the edges of memory. But the story he left behind persists, drifting through history like a ship in fog, half seen, half believed, and wholly unforgettable. Long after the sails had vanished from the horizon and the names of pirates had been inked into legal ledgers and death warrants, the sea remained. It did not change its character to suit the needs of empires, nor did it retain the boundaries that kings and governors tried to draw across it. It remained broad and unknowable, a restless frontier that shifted constantly under the weight of weather, current, and silence. For centuries, men had looked upon the ocean with a mixture of awe and unease, knowing that whatever passed over its surface could just as easily disappear beneath it. And in the years after Blackbeard's death, as piracy retreated from the front pages of colonial reports and into the margins of maritime memory, the ocean quietly became something else. A vast graveyard of forgotten names and half-remembered stories. The world moved on, as it tends to do. Ports grew busier, cities swelled along coastlines, and colonial governments, those same brittle institutions that once begged for help, became more organized, more uniform, more complete in their control. The Royal Navy increased its presence across the Atlantic and Caribbean, building permanent stations and launching patrols that would have seemed unthinkable just decades earlier. Merchant shipping became safer, more regulated, more predictably profitable. The edges of empire, once defined by lawlessness and opportunity, shrank inward. There was less room now for improvisation, for independence, for men like Blackbeard. But if the man had vanished, the idea had not. Blackbeard remained in circulation, not as a historical figure, bound to his time and place, but as something looser, more elastic. Sailors spoke of him in the same breath as sea serpents and ghost ships. His name appeared in newspapers and pamphlets long after his death, often in contexts that had nothing to do with the real Edward Teach. Sometimes he was reported alive, glimpsed sailing under a false flag, or haunting the very waters where he had died. Other times he was invoked as a metaphor, a way to describe a storm, a mutiny, or a threat too vague to name. In time, he became a kind of spectral figure, part legend, part cautionary tale, always a reminder that the sea did not forget. The process of mythologizing him began early and never quite stopped. Writers and balladeers took liberties with his story, reshaping his character to suit their needs. In one version, he was a bloodthirsty savage, delighting in torture and destruction. In another, he was a misunderstood rebel, standing against imperial tyranny with style and wit. Some imagined him as a romantic anti-hero, others as a demon in human form. The truth, by then, had become irrelevant. It had been overwritten by repetition, by imagination, and by the deep human need to assign meaning to the inexplicable. Even in modern times, Blackbeard has refused to be confined. His story resurfaces with remarkable regularity, in novels and films, in museums and classrooms, in the names of sports teams and carnival rides. He is in many ways the most enduring pirate of them all, not because of what he did, which was in truth brief and economically unremarkable, but because of how completely he seemed to embody the idea of piracy itself. The beard, the smoke, the quiet menace, the sudden violence followed by disappearance, it all coalesced into an image that proved difficult to dislodge. And yet, if one strips away the embellishments, the paintings, and the headlines, what remains is still compelling. A man born into obscurity, probably in Bristol, who fought in the War of Spanish Succession, learned the ways of violence and chose to pursue wealth outside the structures that had no use for him. He was not born a villain. He was not raised to command. His rise was steep and swift, marked by intelligence, daring, and a remarkable sensitivity to spectacle. He killed when he had to, frightened when he could, and retreated when he knew the tide had turned. His story is not just one of rebellion, but of adaptation, of a man navigating a world that was itself in flux. What made Blackbeard lasting was not his treasure or his violence, but the shape he left behind. He occupied a moment of transition when the old certainties of empire were beginning to harden, and the loose freedom of the sea was slipping away. He was, in a strange way, the last of a breed, one of the final men to carve out a life at the intersection of chaos and control, where a clever captain could still hold a city hostage, still write his name in fear and fog. As the 18th century pressed on, the sea grew quieter. The ships became larger, the maps more accurate, the ports better defended. But the ghost of Blackbeard lingered. He was not the first pirate, nor the richest, nor even the most violent. But he was, somehow, the most unforgettable. And the sea, with all its silence and salt, has never quite let go of him. What remains of Blackbeard is difficult to measure, because it lives not in one place, but in many, scattered across centuries and stories, driftwood fragments of a life that was never meant to last. His name persists in maps and museums, in history books and tourist signs, in artifacts recovered from shallow waters, and in the whispered lore of sailors. And yet, no definitive portrait of the man has survived. No letter written in his own hand, no detailed journal, no quiet admission of motive. We know him mostly through the voices of those who feared him, those who tried to stop him, and those who found themselves drawn to his image in the years after his death. He remains just out of reach, visible only in silhouette. This is not unusual for pirates. Most of their stories are built from gaps, reconstructed from trial records and complaints, from depositions and rumors and second-hand tales. But Blackbeard's case is different in one way. His story feels complete. It has an arc, a rise and fall, a climax, and a violent end. It is shaped like a fable, yet rooted in fact. And because of that, it has proven irresistible, not just to historians, but to novelists and filmmakers and generations of curious readers who see in his life something more than crime. They see resistance. They see freedom. or they see danger and retribution and the thin line between power and fear. What they see, in truth, is often what they bring with them. Blackbeard is a canvas, and the world has never tired of painting on it. Still, beneath all the retellings, a quieter truth waits. Piracy, for all its drama and theatre, was rarely romantic. It was desperate, dangerous, often short-lived. Most pirates died violently or anonymously. They lived on the edge of empire not to defy it, but because they had no other place within it. The sea gave them a margin, a chance, a path to wealth, or at least to survival on their own terms. But it also offered no protection. There were no laws at sea, no neighbours to appeal to, no higher court. What pirates gained in freedom, they paid for in certainty. They became both predator and prey in a system where mercy was rare and justice was often arbitrary. Blackbeard understood this. He did not believe in the romance of the sea. He believed in leverage, in the power of appearance, in making men think twice before drawing a sword. He crafted a reputation that served him better than any army could. And when the tide turned, as it always does, he met his end without ceremony, surrounded not by loyal followers, but by marines who had been ordered to erase him. His death was not noble, nor tragic, nor particularly meaningful, but it was honest. It was the cost of the life he had chosen, paid in full. Not just the pirate with the black beard and smouldering gaze, but the man who saw how thin the veneer of empire really was. The man who sailed through loopholes and shallows and moments of hesitation, reminding the world briefly that control is never absolute and that the sea answers to no crown. Today, Blackbeard is history, but also more than that. He is part of the collective imagination, a symbol that persists not because of who he was, but because of what he touched. The uncertain edge between law and wilderness, between fear and awe. His story tells us not just about piracy, but about the people who feared it, who hunted it, and who never fully understood it. It reminds us that the sea is not a road or a border or a resource. It is a place, and for a short time, in that place, a man named Edward Teach became something vast and unknowable. A pirate, yes, but also a ghost, one who has never quite left the water.